Good evening. On behalf of the Sake Export Association and the 13 brewers that are here, as well as myself, I'd like to say thank you for inviting us again back here again this year. I just heard from Mr. Sakurai, this is the 16th year. I was surprised to hear that that many years have passed, but it's definitely an indication of how strongly sake is becoming more and more popular. And without a doubt, the best place outside of Japan to drink sake is here in New York City, so thanks for having us again. After a relatively shortish presentation tonight, we'll have 37, Mr. Sakurai said 35, so why don't we go with that? I miscounted. 35 sake from amongst 13 brewers for everybody to taste. Without a doubt, that's going to be the most important and certainly the most enjoyable part of the evening. But we would like to augment that with a little bit of information, a little bit of education before we move to that. After doing this every year for about 16 years, it becomes really a fun challenge to decide what to talk about next, because most of the topics have been covered, and you want to say something that's interesting and useful to people, that they can help them enjoy sake more, but you don't want to repeat yourself either. So this year, after some serious thinking, I came up with the concept of the significance and history of Ginjo, Ginjo sake. I'm sure many of us, if not all of us, are very familiar with Ginjo sake and what it is. And recently, it's actually driving the market quite a bit. But it's interesting to look at the history of it and the significance of it within the overall market of Japan. Before I launch into the main presentation, there's one thing I want to say about it, and I think that's this. Ginjo is likely more than you imagine it to be. There's much more to it than you imagine it to be. At the same time, you might not think it's all cracked up to be. I know that's a bit of a paradoxical statement, but why don't we just bear that in mind and see how, if it becomes clear by the end of the presentation. As I mentioned, I think a lot of people know well what Ginjo is, but just to be sure, Ginjo is super premium sake. And there's a subclass of it known as Dai Ginjo, and to make it easier to remember, I like to say that Dai Ginjo is Ginjo to die for. Often I say when I'm giving a lecture, if you remember one word about sake, let that word be Ginjo. Because if you're drinking something with the word Ginjo embedded somewhere in the label, you're in the safe zone. You're drinking about the best 10% of all sake that's out there. Certainly we hope that you remember more words than just one, but if you were to remember just one, if you remember the word Ginjo, you would be pretty much keeping yourself safe in drinking in the realm of super premium sake. If you were to look at this chart here, which by the way everybody has, I believe in the very last page of the materials that have been distributed to you, but if you look at the top here, you will see these top 4 classifications in the upper right. Ginjo has about 4 sub-classifications, and you can see it's in the realm of premium sake. What I'm trying to point out here, though, is there are a couple of classes of premium sake, Junmai-shu and Honjozo, that aren't quite Ginjo levels, which is why I like to say that Ginjo is actually super premium sake. Now, if you look at Ginjo overall as a classification, there's really 4 subclasses. Ginjo, Junmai Ginjo, Dai Ginjo, and Junmai Dai Ginjo. Now, the shu is kind of often dropped in conversation, like I've been doing for the whole presentation. The character is just another, it's the same character as sake. It's another reading for the character for sake. So Ginjo, Ginjo-shu, pretty much interchangeable. But these 4 classifications together are collectively known as Ginjo-shu. So if you're drinking something with the word Ginjo somewhere embedded in the label, you're going to be enjoying super premium sake, about the top 10% of all sake in production. But let's talk about what it is and what makes it different from the rest of the world of regular sake. In terms of legal definitions, the very first thing that makes Ginjo what it is milling. In fact, the only legal definition of what makes Ginjo what it is milling of the rice. You've got to mill the rice to a certain degree to allow it to be called Ginjo. Now, I'm sure many people remember that the reason we mill the rice is that if you look at sake rice, which by the way is different from table rice, if you look at the rice used for sake brewing, we've got all the starch in the center and we've got fat and protein around that. And fat and protein will lead to off flavors, to strange flavors, to unbalanced flavors. So we want to get rid of those. The way we get rid of those is by milling away more and more of the outside of the grain. And if you mill it to a certain degree, you can ensure that you're going to have a certain cleanliness of flavor, a certain refined flavor. And so the definition of Ginjo basically is that you have to mill away a certain amount of the rice to qualify. Now, if you were to look in the pyramid, in the upper left, the left-hand border of the pyramid will give you the rules for milling, and I just want to touch them for the sake of being complete. In order for a sake to qualify for Junmai Ginjo or Ginjo, you've got to mill the rice down to at least 60% of the original size, which means you've got to grind away the outer 40% before you even begin to mill. To qualify for the top grades, the ginjo to die for, which is dai ginjo or Junmai dai ginjo, you've got to mill away at least 50% of the outside of the grains. I'll come back to that in a minute, but very often that minimum is taken further and people mill the rice a lot further. But when we talk about milling the rice, it sounds like a simple step, but perish the thought. It's a very, very complicated step, or at least the machines that accomplish it are very, very complicated, very high technical machines. And this is what they look like here. Now really, without milling machines like this, we wouldn't have ginjo today. And the way they work is you've got this conical hopper that will hold somewhere between 1.5 and 2 tons of rice typically. And the rice drops down onto a spinning grinding wheel that's kind of hourglass shaped. And a little bit gets nicked off and it goes around and around and around. And they have to be very, very careful when doing this not to crack or break the grains. Because if you do that, fermentation and other things will not proceed in a controllable or predictable manner. So you have to be very, very delicate. Now, what's really interesting is that when you've got all the starches in the center, the outside of the grain is much harder. So the more you mill the rice, the more gentle you have to be. The more delicate it is, the easier it is to crack. So milling it down to daiginjo levels takes not only a lot of time, but a lot of effort and a lot of tweaking as well. As they do that, they're constantly adjusting various things in this machine. The RPMs of the grinding stone, the electrical current that goes to that, the amount of rice that falls down because they want to avoid friction over the many, many, many hours that goes over that. So they're constantly adjusting these things. And the more they mill, the more towards the center they get, the more of the outside they mill away, the more gentle they have to be about it. If we look at the time involved in milling here, most of the rice that we eat, they mill down to about 92% of the original size. In other words, they mill away about the outer 8%. To do that just takes about 8 hours. To mill rice down to the degree where you would qualify for the first levels of premium sake, which is down to about 70% of the original size, it takes about 12 hours. Then to mill it down to ginjo levels, it'll take 24 hours. So to go that extra 10% takes another 12 hours. Now here's where things get really interesting. To mill it down to daiginjo levels, the next 10% takes another 24 hours. And the more you mill it, the more delicate you have to be. The typical maximum, I know that's kind of an oxymoron, but the typical maximum of rice milling for daiginjo is down to 35% of the original size. That will take 72 to 100 hours just to mill the rice, as much as 4 days of milling the rice before they can even begin to brew. This is some of the tender loving care, the intensity that goes into brewing daiginjo. But milling is just one thing that makes ginjo what it is. There's a bunch of other things as well. That's the one legal stipulation, is how much you've milled the rice before you begin to brew. Another pretty much common sense understanding when it comes to brewing ginjo is that you do low temperature, long-term fermentation. There's a number of reasons for that. Fermenting at lower temperatures will give you a much cleaner flavor profile. The same is true for beer and other beverages. On top of that, if you ferment at lower temperatures, you'll stress the yeast and it tends to give you a lot more fruity aromas. So typically, it's an understanding that ginjo is brewed using low temperature, long-term fermentation above and beyond the legally stipulated milling rates. Often though, it means a bunch of other things as well, including using higher quality rice, more expensive rice, and more labor-intensive methods at each step of the process. And I'll come back to those in a minute. Next, I want to talk about how long ginjo has actually been around. Before I do that, the word ginjo itself, what does it actually mean? The character gin is part of a word ginmisuru, which means to strictly select, very carefully select from a number of things. The word jo is another reading of the character for kamosu, which means to brew. So ginjo actually means brewed using very strictly selected methods and ingredients. That's the etymology of the word itself. Looking at how long ginjo's been around, I'm very fond of giving a very quick, short answer to as many things as I can when it comes to sake, the kind of answer you can put in your pocket and use tomorrow. And the short answer, sake's been around for ginjo's been around for about 40 years. As a viable market product, it's only really been out there for about 40 years. The term actually appeared as early as 1906 in an industry publication that was talking about sake that was brewed for a technical competition, a tasting competition that was very technical in nature. So the term's been around for a long, long time. At this point in time, I want to go off on a bit of a tangent, if I may. Ginjo-shu today came about as a result of a long-running tasting contest in Japan known as the Zenkoku Shinshu Kampyokai, or the National New Sake Tasting Competition. And it's just what it sounds like. Japan is the only country in the world where the government sponsors a blind tasting of the indigenous beverage, of the country's national beverage, and gives it awards and gives gold medals and things like that. And interestingly, the tasting took place last week or so, and the results are due to be announced in about 2 hours, actually, for those that are interested. Very literally, they're about in 2 hours in Japan, they'll be announced. It's a very interesting, it's a very prestigious contest. And pretty much every brewer in Japan will, almost every brewer in Japan will submit a sake to that. And the sake that is submitted to those contests, interestingly, is brewed specifically for that contest. In other words, it's not market sake. It's not something we can buy on the shelves. And the stuff that wins contests today is pretty much like today's Daiginjo on steroids. In other words, it's very, very aromatic, very intense stuff. It's probably hard to drink a whole lot of it. And this year is the 102nd running of that competition. So it's been running for over 100 years in Japan. While we could argue that the significance of a contest where the sake is brewed just for that contest and not for the normal consuming public may have dubious merit, the truth is the brewing skills and methods that the brewers used in creating sake for that competition led to today's Ginjo. In other words, they took the methods that they learned of brewing very high quality sake and they applied that to the Ginjo-shu that we enjoy today. So Ginjo really exists because the fact that this contest has existed so long and the brewers were able to learn so much from doing that. I myself would surmise that the Daiginjo we drink today was probably winning gold medals 50 or 60 years ago. But without a doubt, it's what we have today as a result of that long-running competition. But as I mentioned, back then, it was a technical competition. No one's really expected to drink this stuff. In other words, they would brew a tank and probably get about 1,500 bottles of it, I would imagine, and submitted maybe 30 of them to the contest. And the rest, they couldn't really sell. No one would pay the exorbitant prices for that, and no one would really understand the quality involved. So they mixed it in with their cheaper sake. It didn't go to waste, but it really didn't get sold as a product itself. But at least the name itself, the term itself has been around since 1906. Now, the first time a product appeared on the market using the term Ginjo was 1947. In 1975, there were 5,000 sake breweries in existence. When I got to Japan in 1988, there were 2,500. Today, there's about 1,250. So they're dropping off very, very quickly. But back in 1970, that's the subject of a whole nother conversation, but back in 1975, when there were 5,000 of them, there were only 100 Ginjo on the market. Certainly a lot of brewers wanted to try and sell it, but there just wasn't a market for it. There weren't people that saw the value in it that wanted to purchase it. Why didn't more Ginjo develop earlier? Certainly a lot of that is technology. In other words, the wild milling machines that we looked at before, it just weren't readily available back then. I mean, there might have been 2 or 3 of them in existence. That's probably an exaggeration, but there weren't that many. Today, it's very, very accessible. Any brewer that wants to can get their sake milled down to a very high degree quite easily. So the accessibility of technology is one thing that's changed. On top of that, there are new strains of rice, certainly new strains of yeast that have led to more precise and more aromatic and more lively flavor profiles. So those technical reasons are the reasons that we didn't see Ginjo come about earlier, I think, in history. Today, however, almost all breweries make at least some Ginjo. Almost all make at least some. Certainly there's a small handful of breweries that might make only inexpensive sake for their own little market and have no need to mess around with more expensive varieties. On top of that, there are a couple of breweries, and there's at least 2 of them here today, that make only Ginjo. 100% of what they make is Ginjo. But most breweries make all grades, and most breweries make at least a little bit of Ginjo sake. Back then, when they were just starting to get it out, though, it was really hard for a lot of brewers to sell it. I mean, people didn't understand. I remember the story of one brewer who isn't here tonight, but he said he made all this Ginjo stuff, he shipped it all out, and it all came back because no one could understand the flavor profile, and they all thought that he had cut his normally heavy sake with straight alcohol just to improve yields, and so it all came back. He couldn't get the consumers to understand it, so it took some years to do that and to make that happen. Let's look a bit at what makes Ginjo sake different. First of all, in general, it's much more refined. I think one thing we can unequivocally say is that Ginjo sake, the flavor is going to be much more refined, much cleaner, often much lighter than regular sake. Most of it is more aromatic. I mean, there certainly are regions and brewers that are not fond of aromatic sake and will not create so many aromatics in their sake, but most of the time, you're going to get a lot more fruity aromas and floral aromas in Ginjo than you might in regular sake. Some of the other things that make it different are a bit more technical in nature. basically, when you make ginjo, at every single step of the process, there's a lot more stress, a lot more attention to detail, a lot more craftsmanship involved. If we look at some of the concrete examples of that, number one is the size of the batch. When we make regular sake, or futsushu, they tend to make very large batches. It might be a 3-ton batch, a 6-ton batch, a 10-ton batch. There's nothing sacred about these numbers. I'm just giving an indication of size. And the tons refers to the amount of steamed rice that went into the tank to make it. However, when they make ginjo, it's usually much smaller batches. It might be 1.5 or just 1 or even 600 kilograms, much smaller batches. The reason is you can control the parameters a lot more closely. For example, if you've got a huge tank of sake, the temperature in the center is not likely to be the same as the temperature on the outside, and it's very difficult to keep uniformity of temperature throughout. If you've got a smaller tank, you can have much tighter temperature control and make sure that it's uniform throughout the fermenting mash. And that's just one example. There's a lot of parameters that can be controlled with smaller batches. So one difference between ginjo production and larger scale sake production is the size of the batch. Another is fermentation time. Cheap sake, 3 weeks, that's out the door. Sometimes less than that. You can make really inexpensive sake in about 20 days. And a lot of that's perfectly enjoyable. But to make more refined aromatic ginjo, very often that takes almost twice as long. Now, it's fermented at lower temperatures, so the yeast is much more lackadaisical. So it's going to take a longer period of time to get the alcohol that you want as well. But also, fermenting at lower temperatures will give you a much cleaner flavor profile than it might otherwise. Also, the fermentation temperature is much lower. Regular sake is fermented at higher temperatures, whereas ginjo is fermented at lower temperatures. And one of the reasons for this is the lower temperatures will stress out the yeast, and that's where you get your fruit. You get your apples, you get your bananas, you get your other fruity essences by stressing out the yeast, and they give off esters. So that's what's behind the lower temperature things there. As I alluded to before, very often they'll use more expensive rice to make ginjo. I mean, if you're going to take the time to do every single step as carefully as you can, and if you're going to mill the rice way down, very often they'll use the best rice they can. Now, there are about 100 varieties of sake rice out there these days, and within every grade, there's various rankings. In other words, it's inspected. You have various grades within the various varieties. And some are more expensive than others. So very often, if they're going to make ginjo or even dai ginjo, they'll use the best, the highest quality sake rice that has passed the highest inspection level, which is going to cost significantly more. And more significantly, at every single step of the process, as I've alluded to before, much more handcrafted, labor-intensive techniques that will cascade and give you just a little bit more quality at every step of the process, leading to a much more enjoyable, fragrant, and delicate product in the end. While these are not official terms whatsoever, very often we hear people in Japan speak of aji ginjo or flavor-focused ginjo. In other words, ginjo sake where there's more of a focus or an emphasis on the delicateness or the flavors or the richness or the complexity or depth of the flavors and less on the aromas. Certainly we'll have ginjo-esque aromas, but the flavor, it might be more of a focus on the flavor. Another one is something called kaori ginjo, which just means an aromatics-focused ginjo. Very often you have very prominent aromatics in some ginjo sake. And that would be, again, these aren't official terms, they're not legally binding, but you do hear them from time to time. It's just kind of two different ways to look at ginjo sake that's out there. Let's look at how much is actually made. As I mentioned, the ginjo, there's 4 subclasses to ginjo sake. Junmai ginjo, Junmai dai ginjo, and dai ginjo. Together, they are about 10.5% of the market. So about 10% and a little bit more of all sake made is ginjo. About every year, ginjo increases, ginjo production increases just a little bit, maybe 0.5%, maybe 1%, but it's definitely going in a positive direction, while the rest of the grades tend to, well, the lower grades anyway, not all of them, tend to be contracting every year. However, even though it's only 10% of the market, ginjo gets all the spotlight all the time. I mean, you never go to a tasting where they're highlighting their regular stuff. It's always the ginjo. Or, for example, media attention, magazine articles. It's never written about a regular sake. It's almost always written about ginjo. So even though it's only 10% of the market, it tends to get all of the spotlight in most of the media. If we were to look at sake overall, since 1997, sake has dropped about 50% overall. There's a lot of reasons for that, and that also is another topic of a whole nother conversation. But if you look at it, ginjo is actually up over the same period of time. Not massively, but going in a positive direction. All 4 types together has risen about 2% as the rest of the sake has dropped 50%. So Ginjo is actually going in a positive direction. More and more is being made, and the awareness of it is growing as well. 10 years ago, a little more, 15 years ago, it was only 8.3% of production. Now it's risen to about 10.5%, and that's while the rest of the market is actually in contraction. Another thing I want to emphasize is, as I mentioned, it's only been on the market for about 40 years as a viable product. I want to emphasize that that doesn't mean that sake was bad before that, not by any stretch of the imagination. For centuries and centuries, they were drinking very good sake in Japan. It just didn't have the same fruity aromas or the same lightness to it. It was just sake with a more fuller body and richness to it. So sake was good before Ginjo came around. And sake that isn't Ginjo, there's also plenty of good sake that doesn't qualify as Ginjo as well. Another point I want to go into, because it's relevant to what's happening in the market, is to look at the Junmai versus the non-Junmai types. In short, if the word Junmai is there, that means pure rice, and that means the ingredients that went into it were rice, water, and koji only. You may remember that koji is rice with a mold grown upon it that gives us enzymes that give us starch to sugar conversion. Mr. Sakurai also mentioned that there's going to be a whole evening on koji later this month, I think. So koji is just not used in sake productions. They're used in a very wide range of Japanese cuisine. But in any event, it's used in sake producing as well. And the Junmai Dai Ginjo and Junmai Ginjo types of Ginjo are made using rice, water, and koji only. In other words, no alcohol is added. If you look on the right side, it uses, when the Junmai word is conspicuously absent, that lets us know that they have added a bit of alcohol to the brewing process. However, what I want to emphasize is when they make, if you look at the pyramid on the back chart, you see the whole big bottom part of the pyramid, regular sake, futsushu. That's made with a copious amounts of alcohol added to it. And that's done for very good economic reasons, just to increase yields. However, when you get in the realm of premium sake, and especially Ginjo, when they add the alcohol to it, just a little bit is added, and it's done after fermentation is all but complete. And it's done for very good technical reasons, not for economic reasons. Those technical reasons include they're able to pull more flavor and aromas out of the fermenting mash because those components are soluble in alcohol. So after fermentation, they add a little bit of alcohol, temporarily raising the overall alcohol content, and they can pull more out of it. So, and it gives it a better shelf life as well. What I'm emphasizing here is that the added alcohol types of Ginjo are just as valid and just as good as the Junmai types. There are people that insist that the Junmai types are just overall better. Technically, that's not true. If you have a preference, of course, that's important. But the Junmai types are not unequivocally better than their added alcohol counterparts. The other thing I want to clear up is that the non-Junmai types, in other words, Ginjo and Dai Ginjo without the Junmai there, they're not fortified. Now, obviously, we add alcohol to it, and you're saying that's fortifying it, right? While that's true, later they add more water to bring the alcohol content back down to the same as the Junmai type. So all sake, for the most part, most sake has an alcohol content of about 16%. So even when they add the alcohol, they water it back down, so it's not really a fortified product at all. The other thing that I want to mention about the non-Junmai types, the added alcohol types, originally, when Ginjo methods were developed, they were adding alcohol to it. I mean, all Ginjo was originally added alcohol types, or at least some people will say that. Because by adding that, you're able to pull more flavor and aroma out of it, which is what they were trying to do for the contest sake. So originally, all Ginjo did have some alcohol added to it as a part of the process. I've come back to this for a point again. As I mentioned, if you look at Ginjo, it's kind of super premium sake, but there's a couple other grades here, Junmai-shu and Honjozo, that are also part of premium sake. This has a bit of alcohol added to it, whereas this does not. That's relevant when we look at this. While this is a bilingual slide here, what's really important is all sake has been on the decline for a little bit here. And you can see 2 years ago, the Junmai types jumped up over the non-Junmai types. So that would make you think that the consuming public doesn't agree with me and that Junmai types are more popular. However, what's important to remember about this slide is that the stats we just looked at are for all premium sake, not just the Ginjo types. And that the added alcohol type Honjozo is really dropping lately, quite a bit. And that's why the whole curve looks that way. What I'm really driving at is that if you look at the Ginjo realm alone, the Junmai types and the non-Junmai types are both pretty much healthily progressing neck and neck. One isn't really overcoming the other. I'm just trying to emphasize the validity of the non-Junmai types, of the added alcohol types of Ginjo that are out there. Getting close to the end here, is Ginjo really better? Is that really something that we should always be tasting? I remember someone at a tasting one time a couple years ago insisted that she only drank the best. No matter what it was, she only drank the best of anything and immediately went for the Ginjo. I myself have been chided for that in my early years before I got to really understand sake. But the point is, technically speaking, yeah, when you look at all the technology, the brewing skills that went into it, the quality of the rice, the price on there, technically speaking, we can say that Ginjo actually is better than the other stuff. However, it's not always what you're going to want to drink. I mean, it's not always going to be everybody's preference. Certainly, people that like to drink several glasses at once or kind of drink out throughout the night, which, not that I'm condoning that, but not that anything's wrong with it, but if you did try to drink that kind of sake, sometimes the aromas and flavors of Ginjo would get cloying. So a lot of people like to drink more settled, simple types like Junmai-shu or Honjozo, and you can drink those much longer throughout the evening. So it's all a matter of preference, I think, more than anything else. The other thing that I think is interesting is a lot of younger brewers. Right now in the industry, we're seeing a big changing of the guard. In other words, a lot of the older generation or a lot of the fathers are now handing it off to their sons. And it seems to me that there's quite a lot of that happening at once, so kind of a big generation change. And a lot of the younger brewers taking over are much more technically adept, much more involved in the brewing process than the former generation was. And I see a lot of them looking at what's being done with all this Ginjo out there, and it's kind of like, all right, I could brew another fruity sake, but been there, brewed that. I would rather brew a much heavier, richer thing and kind of go in the opposite direction. So to me, lately, amongst younger brewers and more popular sake, I'm seeing a bit more of a tendency to lean toward heavier styles rather than the plethora of lighter fruity Ginjo that's already out there. So in the end, I think, yeah, Ginjo is great stuff. It's the pinnacle of the brewer's art, especially Dai Ginjo is. But really, don't feel an obligation to drink only Ginjo sake. Today, I really think that all sake are worthy of your attention and worth checking out. I think that's an important thing. You need to explore all types of sake and enjoy Ginjo for what it is, but certainly keep an open mind in tasting all sake that are out there. Which is why at the beginning when I said, I mean, Ginjo might not be all you think it is. Certainly at the same time, it's likely more than you imagine it to be. And again, I would like to encourage everybody to taste as many of the 35 or 37 sakes that we have out there and enjoy them as much as you can. At this point in time, what I'd like to do is to have the brewers step up, and I will introduce the brewers, at which point in time they will retreat to the tables and prepare for the coming onslaught. And starting on this side, from Hokkaido, the brewer of Takasago and Ginga-shizuku, Mr. Shikama. Representing Nanbu Bijin from Iwate Prefecture is Ms. Nikawa. Representing Dewa Tsuru from Akita Prefecture is Mr. Amino. Representing Hakuro sake from Niigata Prefecture is Mr. Sto. Representing Kambara and Kirin from Niigata Prefecture is Mr. Sato. Representing Okunomatsu sake from Fukushima Prefecture is Mr. Yusa. Representing Ten Taka sake from Tochigi Prefecture is Mr. Ozaki. Representing Representing Sato Homare sake from Ibaraki Prefecture is Miss Ishiguro. I always mess up one person's name every year. She happened to get the bad draw this year. I apologize for that. From Okayama Prefecture, the brewer of Chikurin, Mr. Marumoto. From Hiroshima Prefecture, the brewer of Fukucho, Ms. Imada. From Shimane Prefecture, the brewer of Rihaku Sake, Mr. Tanaka. From Yamaguchi Prefecture, the brewer of Dasai Sake, representing that company, Ms. Honma. From Saga Prefecture, brewing Tenzan Sake, Mr. Shida. Can we have a round of applause for all the brewers as they go to prepare? At this point in time, if there are any questions about anything related to sake, my presentation tonight or anything else, I'll be more than happy to answer them. Sir?
Hi. So 2 questions. One, is there any correlation between the technical quality of the sake, ginjo, junmai, and so forth, and how dry the sake is? So if it's medium dry, dry, extra dry, whatever. And the second question I have is, which I never understand on menus, what exactly is tokubetsu? I've seen tokubetsu sake, I've seen tokubetsu junmai, I've seen tokubetsu junmai ginjo.
The answer to your first question is that no, there is no correlation between grade and sweetness and dryness. In other words, there's sweet and dry sake at every grade of sake. The second question, if you look in the pyramid in the back, it's actually explained there, but tokubetsu junmai, tokubetsu means special. And tokubetsu junmai is actually a legal classification, but a very vaguely defined one that is junmai-shu that's a little better than average, but not quite up to junmai ginjo levels. Also, tokubetsu honjozo is special honjozo. It's a little better than the average, but it's not quite as good as added alcohol ginjo. So there are legal classifications, and there's stipulations that you need to follow to call them that, but they are vague. If you want to know what they are, I can tell you after thing, but they do exist. So, sir?
With regard to the question of fruitiness or aromatics, the aromas that you're describing which come into the taste are only as the byproduct of the interaction of the yeast with the rice, or are there other elements that are added
generally
to make it fruity?
Right. Generally, fruity esters are produced by yeast. So the short answer, it comes from the yeast and the yeast alone. However, the yeast couldn't work that way if there weren't for 8 other things helping it, and a dozen other things. In other words, the way the koji is made is going to affect how the yeast develops, the temperature at which you ferment, the hardness and softness of the water, the way you feed it. Are you feeding it at an appropriate pace by the sacrification of the starches there? So the yeast is what's going to give us the esters. But there's a supporting cast of a dozen other things behind that.
John, I've never understood what exactly you need to do to be able to put dai in front of ginjo in the name of the sake. What is it?
Mill it more. So in other words, if you mill it down to 60% of the original size, you're allowed to call it ginjo. If you mill it to 50 or more, you're allowed to call it dai.
Thank you.
Now, interestingly, you can mill it beyond 50 and you're not obligated to call it dai. You have the right to call it dai. I think that's the easiest way to remember that. Brilliant. This is good. Is there a question in the back? There is not. One more? Okay, good.
Where does the outer part of the rice go after it is milled away?
It depends on how close to the outer surface it is. So immediately they mill it, the brown stuff very close to the surface will be used for very often for livestock feed. Then when you get a little bit closer to the center, it's a little bit finer. They will use that, for example, traditional crackers. And way near the center where it's very, very fine, they will use for traditional cakes and things like that. So none of it goes to waste. None of it goes to waste.
Okay, a rank beginner's question. Cold or warm, and when should you?
It's easy to answer. Drink your ginjo slightly chilled, most of the time. Most of the time you want to drink your ginjo and all its fruity aromas slightly chilled, because if you warm that, you'll bludgeon out of existence the fruity aromas the brewer tried to create. Are there exceptions? Yes, there are. But most of the time you want to drink your ginjo slightly chilled. Lower grades could go either way. It depends on the flavor profile of the sake, so there's no hard rules. But lower grade sakes might lend themselves to warming a bit more. But the short answer, drink your ginjo slightly chilled, like a white wine, and you'll be satisfied 99% of the time. Folks, I'd like to break now. If there are any more questions, I'll be happy to take them out there. Please enjoy the rest of the tasting and in moderation. Thank you very much.